Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture in History of Western Political Thought. Today, we really have a premiere as this is the first lecture in this edition of the course. This is the first lecture in this course, and it will actually be my first lecture ever given. So please bear with me, and if you have any kind of feedback or comments, please get back to me and we'll adjust accordingly in the upcoming lectures. So, why is this the first lecture in this edition of the course? When Teun and I were discussing the setup for this online version of the course, we thought that it might be useful to include some lectures as, due to the online system, we might be hard pressed for time occasionally. However, normally there were no lectures in this course because we think it's interesting if you get to a personalized understanding of these fundamental texts in the history of Western political thought. These texts can be beautiful, these texts can be difficult, you can struggle with them, but we would like it if you would struggle with them on your own, be marveled, be frustrated, get annoyed, sometimes have a very pleasant read and be pleasantly surprised and overall get your curiosity tickled by these texts rather than us just telling you what our interpretation of these texts are. For this reason, I will not give a full overview of the texts in these lectures, but rather point your attention or draw your attention to some of the important themes which can serve as an input for the in-class discussions later. Alright, then let's start with the text for today and the upcoming tutorial, which is Plato's Republic. The first thing which you might have noticed while looking at the Republic is that it is a rather lengthy text. And I think it's due to spend some time and marvel at the fact that a book this long, this old, it's written almost 2,400 years ago, has been preserved in its entirety. This already gives you an indication of the weight that this book will have for shaping the political thought, at least in the West, that comes afterwards. And as we will see throughout the course, there are many themes or links in later philosophers that we'll read that relate back to this text. So the second thing that you might have noticed is that despite the cast of persona, one person in this book shines by absence, which is Plato himself. So we said that this tutorial would have been on Plato and justice, but besides just being the author, Plato himself is not a character participating in the dialogue that we will read. So we don't get Plato's thoughts directly, but his thoughts are characterized or emphasized by how he sets up the dialogue. However, there is another text found, a collection of letters which Plato wrote, in which one of them he talks about his reasons for writing the Republic. And I think it's interesting to have a look at that. So I would like to quote a small section from the 7th letter of Plato, in which he talks about why he wrote the Republic. When I was a young man, he wrote this at the end of his life, I felt as yet many young men do. I felt at the very moment I attained my majority, I should engage in public affairs. And there came my way an opportunity that I want to tell you about. The democratic constitution, then loudly decried by many people, was abolished. And the leaders of the revolution that set themselves up as a government of 30 men with supreme authority. This became known later as the tyranny of the 30. Some of these men, you must understand, were relatives of mine and well known to me. And what is more, they actually invited me once to join them, as though politics and I were a fit match. I was very young then, and it was not surprising that I felt as I did, though that the city was then living a kind of life which was unjust, and that they would bend it to a just one. and so administer it more justly. So I eagerly watched to see what they would do, and you must know that when I looked on, I saw those men in a short time make the former democracy look like a golden age. So, even though there was a lot of criticism at the democratic rule of Athens before, Plato was considering joining his relatives in the government of the 30, yet he saw that it got even worse and worse and worse as time continued. Let's continue the quote. I looked at this, you see, and the men who were in politics and the laws and customs, and the more I looked and the older I grew, the more difficult it seemed to me to administer political affairs justly. For you cannot do so without friends and comrades you can trust, and such men it was not easy to find. For the city, you see, no longer lived in the fashion of our fathers. Eager as I had once been to go into politics, as I looked at these things and saw everything taking any course at all, with no direction or management, I ended up feeling dizzy. I did not abandon my interests in politics to discover how it might be better in other respects, and I was perpetually awaiting my opportunity. But at last I saw, as far as all states now existing are concerned, they are all badly governed. But the condition of their laws is bad almost past cure, except for some miraculous incidents. So I was compelled to say, and praising true philosophy, that from it alone that was able to discern any justice. And so I said to the nations of the world, will never cease from trouble until either the true breed of philosophers shall come to political office, or until that of the rulers shall by some divine law take to the pursuit of philosophy. So, what do we see in this section is that Plato was not only concerned or discontent with the political states of Athens, where he was from, but from most of the city-states that he knew, seeing them all collapse or fail in one or other way. While this decreased his appetite for joining in politics directly, he kept being interested in the question of how then can we rule a state in such a way that it would be just. And this, in the end, in the Republic, leads Plato to the conclusion that states cannot be justly governed until kings shall become philosophers, and philosophers shall be kings. How he defends this claim, we will focus on in the two tasks on Plato. Yet for now, let's first look at what Plato means with justice. And that will be our particular exercise for today. Yet one more comment needs to be made about the text before we delve into it more detailed. So, we've introduced some characters and said that Plato wasn't there, but the text itself is a dialogue between these characters, which is something that you might not have expected when reading your first text in political philosophy. It is not written at all like a philosophical treatise. It actually has some elements of a novel in there. Characters talking, an occasional description of scenery. So a literary approach might be instructive at some points while reading or trying to figure out what the Republic says. In this regard, let's have a look at the three characters that are presented to us in our first reading, so book 2. We see Socrates conversing with Glaucon and Adiamantus. Note that Glaucon and Adiamantus are two brothers of Plato, actually. But how are these persons typified? What is their character? As you might have noticed, Glaucon can be characterized by an insistence on loyalty. Right? When he does his speech on what he thinks justice is, he says something along the lines of justice is being loyal to one's friends and harming one's enemies. Besides that, we can also see that he's driven by a hunger for glory. The other brother, Adiamantus, however, is more focused on the pleasures of life and that it should be enjoyable. You'll see elements of this back in his speech as well. Socrates, of course, being the teacher of the company or the also wise philosopher. What becomes evident is that these three personalities all correlate to a specific dimension of the soul which Plato identifies. Glaucon representing spirit, Adiamantus representing the appetites, and not surprisingly, Socrates being closely affiliated with the third element, rationality or reason. So where we start the text, Glaucon and Adiamantus are debating with Socrates, although they're not unfavorable to his position. They're open for learning, but they're not convinced yet. And they are talking about basically whether justice is valuable for its own sake, so intrinsically valuable, or only valuable because of what it produces, instrumentally valuable. And they are trying to discover the nature of justice. So, in this conversation, they're basically extending a conversation which happened in book 1, which you did not have to read. But in this book 1, it's nice to give some context, a Cynic philosopher by the name of Thrasymachus maintains the claim that justice is nothing but to the advantage of the strong, claiming that's in the interest of rulers and that justice is basically something for the simple subject. Socrates refutes this claim, or attempts to refute this claim, yet the two brothers are not satisfied with Socrates' answer. And that's why they take side with I'm sorry, I'm horrible with Greek names, Thrasymachus, in order to tease out what the better or stronger argument would have been on the side of Socrates. So let's have an example, because I think this idea which Thrasymachus puts forward is something that came up in pre-discussion quite often as well. Right, where we were discussing the example with the ring, a lot of people said, yeah, but what if the state itself isn't just? I might have a personal sense of justice. Somebody brought up that we don't live in real democracies nowadays, and that therefore it would not necessarily be unjust to break the rules, or that there might be distinction between a personal sense of justice and then just law abiding. So I think that Thrasymachus' position is kind of sympathetic to this. So let's look at how the argument is laid out. Thrasymachus basically makes an example to maintain his claim, if we want to summarize it briefly, in which he says, when a just man and an unjust man do dealings with one another, this will always be beneficial to the unjust man, where the just man will not try to cut any corners and stays to the formal arrangements of the deal. The unjust man might try to play or cheat the just man, therefore attaining either the lion's share or at least a bigger proportion of the fruits that come out of these dealings together. Therefore, Thrasymachus maintains that thus it is, Socrates, that injustice, realized on an adequate scale, is stronger and freer, a more lordly thing than justice. And as I said in the beginning, justice is the advantage of the stronger. Injustice, a thing profitable and advantage to oneself. This clearly relates back to the discussion that we had. Right? So this is the position he maintains. Justice is not something that is to be praised on its own. It's either to some extent imprudent or stupid to stick to the rules of justice, but lordliness, that is injustice. So, how does Socrates respond to this? Well, Socrates, as we might know, sticks to the position that justice always needs to be more profitable and is more profitable than injustice. Even when one can get away with his injustices. So even if you could put on that ring, that allows you to commit hideous crimes or just small benefits to yourself, Socrates maintains the position that this is not to your benefit. And he does this, you can see this in section 349d, with a very basic argument, which runs along the following lines. So Socrates says, the just man does not get the better of his like, so other just men, but he does get the better of his unlike, for it is not wrong for a just man to take advantage of the unjust. The unjust man, however, gets the better of his like and unlike, because there will not be something wrong for an unjust man trying to cheat another unjust man or another just man. Then he has an example which you could pay attention to about musicians and physicians, from which he distills the following proposition, that a knowledgeable person does not interfere with or tries to get the better of someone who's equally or more knowledgeable to him, where he has no problem with outsmarting or outdoing somebody who is less knowledgeable in the specific field. Then he ends with the claim that knowledge as a virtue is good. So if we add all of this up together, we will see that the just man is the knowledgeable or the prudent man. It's not prudent to cheat on others. And besides that, since knowledge is a virtue, that the just man must be good. But you, maybe like the two brothers, might be left wanting here. Because what Socrates basically did is not to show what justice is, but at least showed that Thrasymachus's argument was wrong. Right? So Thrasymachus had the categories upside down, but we are still left wanting in regards to pinpointing to us what justice is. So Thrasymachus had a definition. Socrates shows that that one is internally contradictory, cannot work out, but he hasn't gotten us the answer to what justice is yet. And this is what the two brothers take up in their book 2, so where we started our readings, starts off. So let's have a look at section 358, because there we see the position that Socrates will be maintaining. And he says, justice should be valued alike for its own sake and for its consequences. So remember that we talked about these four different categories that justice could be in our pre-discussion. So it could be instrumentally valuable, intrinsically valuable, intrinsically and instrumentally valuable, and no value and not valuable at all, of which Socrates takes up the position that it is the third one. To come to this argument, Socrates says that we should maybe not labor the point of what justice is in the context of the individual person, but that it might be more productive or prudent to investigate this question in the context of the city, as it is larger. So it might be more easily to discover what justice is in this context in comparison to a microscopic analysis of the individual. The others agree to this approach in the conversation, and hence they embark upon the journey to design a good city and then try to allocate or identify where justice resides into it. When you read the argument about how to design a good city, pay attention to the different steps that are taken in expanding the city, which roles are necessary, how they react, and which role they play in the city. On top of that, pay attention to the role of natural endowments, or natural talents, and the role that they play within the society and how that is a part of structuring society. Something else that is interesting to have a look at is that the warrior class, or the auxiliaries, need to not only be trained in the arts of war and vigilance, so trained at the gymnasium to be physically strong. No, they also need to be trained in the arts of music and poetry. Why is this the case? Why does the group that is charged with the defense of the city have to read books, listen to music, go to plays, and be aware of this? To us, this would surely seem odd, that if we would join the army, that we would get classes on literature, for instance. Right? So why do they have to do this? On top of that, pay attention to the living conditions of this auxiliary class, which are also not living conditions that we would consider pleasant. So a big chunk of book 3 and later on book 5, so for next class, will focus on this regulation or control of the auxiliaries and the functions they have to play in the society. Now that our city has grown to completion, so at the end of that argument, we basically find that there are 3 classes in the society. Right? A class of workers, artisans, farmers, a class of these auxiliaries, and a class of rulers, which are to be picked from the wisest or most apt of these auxiliaries and guardians. Plato mentions that these classes all have a different kind of soul. Right? Some have a golden soul, the rulers. Some have a silver soul, the auxiliaries. And the others either have a copper or an iron soul. These are from the workers or artisan farmers class. Why does he make this analogy? What is the role that this plays? Now, if we zoom in on the soul a bit more, we should note that Plato identifies 3 elements: appetite, spirit, and rationality. As we already said, the 3 characters in the conversation all represent one of these characteristics. But the different classes that we just identified also represent one of these 3 different characteristics: the artisans, workers, farmers, the appetite, the auxiliaries, the spirit predominantly, and the rulers are predominantly governed by their reason. Let me see, where were we in this story? Yeah. So, what does the hierarchy look like in the system? Basically, the workers and guardians need to cooperate, but this might cause some friction, and therefore this higher class of rulers is necessary, which were characterized by rationality. When a structure is thus organized, we can say that we have accomplished the good city. Now, where does justice reside in all of this? And then the 4 men set out on another question where they say that a good city must have 4 virtues: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice at last. They try to identify the 3 virtues that they're known with to then say that the rest must be justice. So, you can only call a city wise if it's prudent in the science of guardianship, Socrates proposes. And then who in the city is concerned with this science of guardianship? It's the rulers. So a city is wise by virtue of its rulers. It's allocated in ruling class. Courage may speak for itself, right? Obviously related to war and conflict. So courage resides within the auxiliary class. Moderation, and here he takes an interesting line of reasoning. He says when somebody is moderated, he basically is in self-control, right? He's stronger than himself. And he says, how can I be stronger than myself? Because if I'm stronger than myself, I must also be weaker to myself, which seems contradictory. So he says in the city that must refer to the stronger or smarter, prudent, wiser class being in control of the other classes and therefore balancing each other out. So it's a sense of harmony that takes care of moderation and therefore can be found in the whole city combined. So, where's justice then? And here it's important to have a look at section 433. What at the beginning we laid down as a universal rule of action when we were founding our city, this is, if I am not mistaken, or some modification of it, justice. I think we affirmed, if you recollect and frequently repeat, that every individual ought to have some one occupation in this city, which should be that to which its natural capacity was best adapted. So at the end of locating all of this, they basically realized that, wow, this is what we started out with, that you should be good as a person to create a good city, so focus on what you do best, that this is what makes a city just. If everybody does what he has to do in accordance with his natural capability. So it's basically a harmony of the three classes that we have identified, or cooperation amongst the three classes under the leadership of the ruling class. Now, let's go back to the individual, the just person, now that we have allocated or found or discovered where justice is within a society. As we saw, all of these three classes basically related to different parts of the soul. So if the city is just when basically spirit, the guardians, appetite, the workers, and rationality, the rulers, cooperate under the leadership of rationality, we had a just city. So in this case, we'll have a just soul when appetite, spirit, and reason work together under the rule or leadership of rationality. So Plato says or Socrates speaking in section 435c, then my friend we shall make the same claim in the case of a single individual, and supposing him to have the same from his soul on account of having the same affections as those in the city, we shall judge that he can be deemed worthy of the same names as the city. So a just person lives just in the way, or is organized in the same way as the just city. Are you convinced by this argument? Are you convinced with how Plato describes his notion of justice, how his argument basically builds up a lot on his conception of the soul and that analogy between the soul and the state? And does it hold up in the light of modern psychology, you might wonder? So are these three components really there? Are they a good illustration of how we function? Or do you think that Plato overemphasizes unity and forgets the identification of interest, especially since each person will have these three elements in his soul, but then is basically forced to work in a field that, or be a member of a class that his soul predominates? What about these other elements that we have in our soul? And if we have people, for instance, who are ruled or are more characterized, or their spirit element of the soul is stronger, they become guardians. But we just said that a just soul is a soul in which reason guides all of the other elements. So according to Plato, there might be a lot of unjust souls in his society, to which the people who have this unjust soul really can't do that much about. They can guide it and make it work for the common good, but on an individual level, they're still not the most virtuous person. And what does that mean? How do you rule a city in which so many individuals, at least, might be or will have a unjust soul? What does that say about the education that we need in a city? Think now back about the story of the souls in the metal, right? Socrates brought this as a lie that we need to tell them, that we needed to make them believe. So this might be interesting with propaganda, right? Do we have to be true to our citizens as a government? Because some citizens might not listen if they're not deceived. What do we think of this? I think we can expand on this in the tutorials. And with all these questions, I will leave you now and I will end this lecture for today. I hope that some of these questions will pick your mind. I hope that the lecture was useful in understanding this class and understanding this text. And I'll see you all in class fairly soon. Bye bye.